Next speaker starts now with, let's call it a new endeavor. It goes into more human aspects, maybe sometime philosophical and ethical aspects, and he will try to show us how responsibility can be lived and not just talked about. So, please.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Professor Neusch, for the introduction. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's an honor to speak to you. I fear I will talk about ethics and have no example living ethically. I know it's late in the afternoon, and now that's something completely different. I will present a longer argument in this field of risk ethics, and even if it's later in the afternoon and 3 days after this terrible change from the summer to the winter time, I hope you have the concentration for this presentation. I will begin discussing a certain thesis in the field of risk ethics. If we are dealing with technologies, there are always the thesis that we have to look at the risks and the positive effects of a certain technology, and that it would be morally wrong if we only look at one side and not on the other side, that we have to discuss the risk and the chances. And I will show that this hypothesis is a little bit too easy, that we speak carefully about the thesis, and that it is in certain respects wrong. But first I have to say something about ethical theory, that you will find the way I will speaking about moral questions. You have to wait a long time in this presentation. If in the last 2 or 3 files I will should say a little bit about biotechnology, but first I speak a very long time about morally and ethical questions. But why is this the best way to show you the problems and the possible answers? For many people, ethics is a very simple thing, that you have certain false theoretical moral beliefs. If you think on waterboarding, you see that it is wrong. You have strong intuitions, strong beliefs, what is morally right and morally wrong. And many people think, even in the field of moral philosophy, that such strong beliefs are true, self-evident axioms which you cannot discuss. But I think it's wrong. First, I do not know what it means that I can see the morally wrong. Second, my own beliefs, what is morally wrong and right, it starts with my biography. I learn that lying is bad. I have a history in my own life. I stand in a certain history, in a certain tradition. And what an intuition is a certain representation of a person living in a certain history and a certain biography. So it's too easy and wrong if you only look at something and say, it's so easy, it is wrong. If you want to judge a thing, the moral acceptability of risk, for example, you have to be careful and you have to discuss abstract questions. And therefore, you have to look at the ethical theories. And here, that you can see where's my position. First, I'm not a utilitarianism. A utilitarianist is a certain position that they have a certain act, for example, a field trial, that you have to look on all possible outcomes and the likelihood of all possible outcomes and the outcomes for each sentient being, not only for human beings but for all sentient beings, and have to look if it is affected in a positive or in a negative way, and afterwards you have to take a net calculus and a net analysis and you have to choose this option which maximizes the good. That's the utilitarianist way. But if you have to look for all the options you have, there are two problems, and these problems are the reasons why I'm not a utilitarianism. First, we have something which is called the identity argument. If you have a certain person, call him Jacob. Jacob wants to be a biologist. But if he is also a utilitarianism, he has to consider all the options he have to become a biologist, to go in the third world, working as a philosopher, or something more stupid, even more stupid. And then he has to find the best possible outcome in an abstract way. But if he always choose such a thing, always judge all possible outcomes, the thing which Jacob is, a person who loves biology, disappears, because you have always to think about in the abstract way, of all possible outcomes, in a point of view like the point of view of God, which has no own interests. And therefore, utilitarianism is a very demanding theory in ethics, because we have no identity, we are only machines who make a certain calculus, and Jacob Niche disappears. But that's not the best argument against utilitarianism, because utilitarianism would say we have to do it. Even if you are not a person with a personal identity, with certain ideas, interest, love interests, and so on, we have to choose this because it's a moral duty. But why should it be my moral duty to maximize the general good of all beings, even of all sentient beings, rats, mice, and so on? And therefore we should await that a utilitarianist theory gives us a good answer in this field. Why should we do it? But if you look at the papers, I make it very short, you find no answer. You give no justification. They only say, do it. And therefore, if they don't give me a good answer, I choose the other position. And from the ethical point of view, I'm a contractualist. I think we cannot live without a morality as human beings. We need certain rule for our life. And there are certain rules which are in the interest of each person. And what is in the interest of each person is justified. That's my position. And if I'm looking for such rules which are in the interest of each person, then you cannot be a utilitarianist, because it's not in our interest to become a utilitarianist. And so I prefer the second possibility, a deontological theory in ethics. Roughly speaking, all deontologists of old stripes say that we have not only to look at the outcomes, that we have other criteria besides the outcomes. This is a very famous position. It's a position which lays behind the constitution of all Western countries, including Switzerland, and so it has its possible advantages, speaking with non-ethicists. But if we go to the field of risk, we have a problem, because risk refers to outcomes. And so, what is the position of a deontologist like myself regarding risk? If you speak about risks, we refer to unwanted events which may or may not occur. And we have always to consider two things. First, the probability of the negative effect and the magnitude. This is very important, so I say it again, that we always have two aspects, the magnitude of harm and the likelihood of harm. And we need always both. We're speaking in the field of risk and about risks when we are in lack of knowledge. When there is a risk, There must be something that is unknown, that is may or may not occur, and knowledge about risk is always knowledge about such lack of knowledge. And we have to find a way to deal with it. And what is the possible way? The first problem is if you speak about negative effects, about harm. What is a harm? Harm is a concept which is always value-alone. You say that something is to be evaluated negatively, and therefore you always need a theory of harm and a value theory to speak about harms. And the consequence that empirical science is very important, but it cannot determine how a risk is acceptable or not. We need further points. And first, to go on with such a risk assessment in the field of risk ethics, we have to look, what is a harm? Very often, but not always, the magnitude of harms is assessed referring to a so-called prudential theory of the good. I don't think that many of you have heard about prudential theory of goods. Prudential theory of good means that something is good for you, for he or she, for a single person. Well-being is a prudential good. It is good for me to have well-being. And other things, money, it would be good if I have more money, for example. And if you have risk assessment, most times they refer to such a prudential theory, speaking about well-being, but the question is, it is correct. If you are a utilitarianist, you have to use such a language, because a utilitarianist looks on the effects, the outcomes, and have to judge it, and then you say it's good for a sentient being or not. But if you are making risk ethics to using prudential terms, well-being, life quality, death, if death is bad for someone, then you always are in a utilitarianism framework. But what is if utilitarianism is wrong? Then you have to choose another option. It is right and okay to use a prudential framework for individual decisions. So chances and risks, eating a hamburger, you have to need a prudential theory of the good. If you make an economic risk assessment, you have to choose a prudential theory. But the question is, what is in the field of ethics? If you speak about what is morally acceptable or not. And then we have to go on and have to look what is in this field, what are here, the answers. If you go to the field of risk ethics, the premise of many articles is that we have a duty not to harm, not to kill someone, and therefore we also have a duty not to perform actions that increase the probability of being harmed. That's the general way. But here's a certain problem in this field. If you take an example, a very abstract example, of an action of a person A, and it has positive effects on two other persons, B and C. For B it is good, and C it is not good. Utilitarianism will build a calculus, and if the positive effects of A and B are greater than the negative effects and better than any other options, you have to act in such a way. In a deontological ethics, you cannot speak in such a way. Take, for example, a very simple idea. We have two persons who fell in love with Jacob. Jacob chooses Anna and not Barbara, then it is good for Anna and for Jacob, but it's not good for Barbara. But nobody of us would say that it's morally wrong to choose one of the ladies. There very often we would speak about morally right acts which have negative effects on others, but they are not wrong. And therefore, we have to change our harm theory in the field of ethics. It would over-demanding that we cannot do something which harm everybody. And what is the consequence? Acts which are affecting the potential goods of others are only morally wrong if and only if the affected person has a moral right not to be treated in a certain way. Nobody of us has a moral right that Jacob loves us. Therefore, he can choose. Other fields, no students have a moral right to get a very good note or review. Therefore, we cannot give a student a 2 or 3, even if it is bad for the student to get a 2 or 3. So, when we go to the risk ethics, we don't have to look about prudential goods. We have to look on moral rights. And looking on moral rights, there we can go on and find solutions. A negative effect is only morally relevant if we have a moral right not to be affected in such a way. And topics in the field of risk ethics are acts which increase the probability that a moral right is violated. That's the approach which we should choose. If we have no other option in the field of moral philosophy and ethics but to choose a deontological position and to choose a moral right approach regarding harm, there are further consequences. First, there is a moral right which protects us from risk imposing. If it would be allowed that others can impose all risk on us, our own life would be very difficult. We have to do so much to prevent ourselves from this risk, so it's not possible. And on the other hand, if we would choose a rule that we cannot impose risk to others, it would also be impossible to live, because perhaps I have a small flu, I impose risk on you. Perhaps here, becoming this water, it's a risk imposition. I don't know. It's a very small probability. I will drink it. No, sorry. Don't worry. So, we have to find a third option. And the option is that we have to separate acceptable risk and not acceptable risks. And in the consequence, we have a moral right which protect us from non-acceptable risks imposing, but we have on the other side the moral right to impose acceptable risk. That's the deal. We can impose certain risk, but we have to accept the same risk if other person acts the same way. That's the way we are dealing on the streets, in the car, on bicycles, and not on bicycles, only on car. Bicycle drivers are a little difficult. So, we have a certain moral right which protect us from non-acceptable risk. If such a moral right exists, we have no possibility in the ethical frame. It's not allowed to build a calculus, because if someone has a moral right, certain things should not done to this person, even if it had positive effects on others. In the consequence, we have only to look on the person who is affected. If you have the moral right to live, I have to protect your moral right to live, even if it has advantages for my daughter or my son if I kill you. We have only the right position. Looking on certain example, if you have a certain action A, and with a certain probability Jacob dies, with a certain probability Klaus Peter dies, Anna dies, or Barbara dies, we have to look on each column, and in this case, we don't say that we have here acceptable risk for Jacob and perhaps not for me. I think not for me. So, in this moral right approach, if a violation of a moral right has positive effects for others, it is still a violation of this right. And the positive effects are irrelevant. And therefore, the hypothesis from the beginning is wrong. The only exception is if we have certain moral duties. If we have moral duties, then other persons have a right that we do our duty. So it's a difference, to take the lecture of Mr. Grissom, if we use biotechnology to better the well-being of person, or if we have a moral duty regarding the hungry persons. In the last case, we can discuss the question, is there a dilemma and how to go on with the moral rights, but we have to leave all considerations of prudential goods. If we speak about such acceptable risk, we have only to look if a certain risk is acceptable and if it is acceptable for each person. If a right is violated, it's a difficult question. You violate a right or not. So acceptability in this field is only to be judged on the question of the probability. And risk is acceptable for each person if the violation of this right is improbable. And for improbability, we need a certain intersubjective measure, a threshold. For human beings, for example, life, for example, it's many articles say it's 1 to million. But proportional to the importance of a moral right, we need different thresholds. The improbability which protects the moral right to live is higher than regarding property rights. What we try in the field of deontological risk analysis is to find criteria. These criteria are criteria regarding what we do to each person or each sentient beings, and then to look, is this acceptable what we are doing? If we have 3 options, option 1 will be that with a probability of 1 to 2, A and B will die. Option B will, with a probability of 1 to 2 billion, 2 billion people will die in Asia. Or in C, that we have different probabilities for different people. Only one of this option is morally right, and this is the second. So even if there are here so much, the worst case is so much harder, it's the only morally right, because for each person who is affected, it is acceptable risk to have a risk of 1 to 2 billion that your moral right to live is violated. If you go on with other examples, you have to go to other rights too. It would be a little bit complicated. But important is you have always to look on the vulnerable groups, have to look, is here a certain right be affected, and then you have to look on the probability side. and you can answer this question. That's, in short form, a long argument. I hope you are still awake. Go on to the last section, biotechnology. Only a few words, I have only a few minutes left. If you go to biotechnology, if the analysis is correct, we cannot and should not evaluate whole technologies. That would be nonsense. We cannot speak as biotechnology is morally acceptable regarding the risks, or not. We have to look on single cases, examples, a single field trial, the release of a special crop in a special local condition, agricultural system, and so on. That's the first point. Then we have to consider the lack of knowledge. Perhaps regarding certain plants like GM plants, like BT mice, we have enough knowledge in the world. But the problem is we need knowledge if a certain moral right is affected. And we need local answers, very concrete answers. So we cannot only say in the United States we have no problems. We have to look very specific. That's the problem. That's not the answer. That's the answer is it's not acceptable. But if the analysis is right, we have to go in more detail for special conditions. That's the first point. The second point is the problem, always the problem, of the unintended and unexpected or unexpectable consequences. Here we have the problem, can we get probabilistic terms here? And in many fields it's very difficult to find here answers. But to get answers, the possible damage first has to manifest himself. And when it manifests himself, we can make an ethical risk analysis. And if you would, the last sheet, therefore, in all these fields, dealing with biotechnology in general, the biotechnology in the field of GM, we have to look on special acts. We have to respect the step-by-step procedure. But very important, we have also to look in the step-to-step procedure when it is possible to go from one step to the other. When it is possible to leave the laboratory, to go to the field, and so on. And if you look in the discussions in Switzerland, in other countries, to clarify this criteria, I don't think that we're here on the end of discussion. There are further discussion needed, but now I'm at the end of my time, and therefore thank you very much for your tolerance. Thank you.